I was brought up with the understanding that we humans were born as tiny, unprincipled beasts, that it was our parents and our religious institutions that taught us right from wrong. As I grew older, however, I began to wonder. Real life moral and ethical choices seemed to be pervasive, a constant part of daily life. Yet most of those choices I made unconsciously, without ever really thinking about them. And the ones that did require conscious reflection turned out to be a good deal more complex than anything I'd ever been taught to deal with in church or by my parents' example. Other than the Ten Commandments, which are, after all, pretty basic, I couldn't recall getting much help at all from the various Protestant churches and Sunday schools I'd attended in my youth. Maybe what I'd been taught was subtle, but I really did not recall learning much that was truly useful in dealing with the very real and deeply complex moral issues that I, like every single one of us, faced later in life in my usual daily life. In other words, I felt I seemed to have a very powerful sort of innate sense of what was right and what was wrong. It didn't feel to me like it was something that I'd been taught or shown by example. I just knew. It was while I was researching my recent science fiction novel, Darwin's Dilemma, that I realized a likely answer. In writing that book, I needed to explore the point of view one might anticipate in a future autonomous, self-programming artificial superintelligence. How might such a being respond to moral constraints that run counter to its more immediate personal self-interest? That's when I recalled what I'd learned in studying social evolution back in college. And it's what struck me that humans, as creatures that evolved socially as well as individually, must, of necessity, have a built-in moral code. A code that we didn't just learn from our parents or from our society, but a code that rested on the genetic traits and preferences which underlie the unconscious but powerfully socially responsible behaviors that societies need their members to have if they're to survive and prosper. After all, if the societies of which my forebears had been a part had failed, there'd have been a greatly increased chance that those individuals, my forebears, would have failed as well, and I wouldn't be here. That's when I gave some further thought to a phenomenon that I had taken granted for most of my life. Namely, how is it that different societies everywhere on Earth seem to have come to very similar conclusions concerning acceptable social behaviors and matters of basic right and wrong? Most of these societies existed in isolation from one another for tens or hundreds of thousands of years. They didn't have common experience with religion. They didn't have common cultural threads. Yet when they were later discovered, I put that in quotes, by explorers, they inevitably turned out to have remarkably familiar social codes. Codes that were easily recognized and understood by explorers. Social codes that often formed the basis for understanding, very often the basis for trade. Most likely, of course, this is simply because every society, no matter where or what it is, faces the same inherent problems, and it has to overcome those same common social threats. Think about it this way. As creatures who descended from primates, we humans have presumably emerged from a genetic pool made up of decidedly social animals. Wherever we ended up on Earth, we were still social creatures from the very start. In fact, one of the more well-regarded theories about the origins of human intelligence is that its original evolutionary advantage was grounded in our need to cope with the staggering complexities of social interaction itself. Those complexities are a part of our ancient social evolutionary makeup. Over the millennia, whenever human societies failed, the survival of its members was thrown into serious doubt. When societies succeeded, their members survived and succeeded as well. Our human natural selection has to have had favored traits that helped our respective societies prosper and succeed. Human traits that damaged society, or those humans lacking the ones that supported their society, they would have tended to disappear. Those traits that facilitated the survival and success of societies must have been naturally selected, just as were the traits that aided our survival as individuals. Inevitably, both those social and individual traits have come to exist in some form together in every single one of us. Without our social groups, we are highly vulnerable. The success of our society is essential to our personal well-being. But so is looking out for our own immediate self-interest. So over the millennia, we have acquired and refined survival traits simultaneously for both. Traits that help us survive as individuals, right alongside traits that help our groups succeed. Within us there is, therefore, a natural conflict. Those differing sets of traits very often lead to contradictory answers. They are often at odds. So we humans have come to see this natural, unavoidable, internal interaction between conflicting survival traits as a struggle between the forces of right and wrong, the power of good and evil. Once you know this, you can actually see it playing out in our culture almost everywhere you look. The story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is probably as perfect an example as we'll find. Or consider Dracula repelled by the Christian cross. Or consider a werewolf that turns into a man and then into a monster on the full moon. This conflict is implicit in one of my all-time favorite novels, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It's explicit in Freud's depiction of a superego which struggles to manage the excesses of our ego. It's built into our criminal law, where mens rea, or wrongful intent, is commonly required for one to be considered guilty of a criminal act. And it is certainly present in our religions, Christianity's concept of heaven and hell, for example. It's a conflict that also was explicit in Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, in which the world's brightest and most creative minds were encouraged to shrug off the constraints of society so that they could be free to better the world with their righteous individualism and be empowered by an unregulated capitalist economy. But there was an amazingly different, interesting take found in Arthur Koestler's 1967 book, The Ghost in the Machine. Koestler argued that our evil side, read individual self-interest, was an atavism, a poorly buried and generally unhelpful and carryover that came from our earlier, primitive, uncivilized past. In a separate video, How We Humans Know Who We Can Trust, Thank Darwin, I discuss how these two critical but necessarily contradictory sets of evolutionary traits have required us to develop skills and mechanisms that help us cope and resolve the inconsistencies between the two. This is how we've acquired a remarkably and uniquely human capacity for determining who we can trust and who we must not. I think all of us recognize within ourselves this eternal sort of competition between good and evil, between right and wrong. Uh, shall we wait in line or crowd in ahead of others? Do we contribute to a worthwhile charity today or go out on the town tonight and treat ourselves to a sumptuous dinner? Should we rob a bank or get a job? Should we save another or save ourselves? Punish or forgive? Go to war? Negotiate peace? Our societies cope with the more egregious antisocial behaviors by demotivating them through criminal punishment, while less damaging conduct is dealt with through social sanctions. But sanctions of any kind are always going to be less than perfect because the alternative individual survival traits are just as powerfully and perhaps justifiably embedded also in our character. We all know there are some people among us who seem unable to tell the difference between socially acceptable and unacceptable conduct. We refer to them as narcissists or sociopaths. Conversely, we also all know people who seem prepared to almost always conform, to make nearly any sacrifice for a larger society that might seem appropriate. Each of us strikes a certain balance between these two extremes. We find our unique path through life's moral wilderness. Our often, I think, astounding ability to navigate through these complexities is a talent we all acquire early, and we draw upon that every single day of our lives. It should probably be noted that this argument that I'm making to you today does hang upon a certain equivalency between what is antisocial and what we think of as morally or ethically wrong, or conversely, between what we believe is right and what we consider to be good. I believe if you gave this some careful thought, you'll conclude, as I have, that those two concepts, at least generally, are very much the same. The conduct which is believed to be good for society is largely identified with what we think of as good, and acts which harm other people or corrupts or damages society is one which most of us would generally agree is morally wrong, an evil act. Perhaps some of you will disagree. If so, I urge you to feel free to let me know in the comments. I'd really love to hear what you have to say. If you'd like to see a written version of this presentation along with a bibliography of the annotations I've assembled in the research that supports it, you might take a look at my website at www.donstuart.net. That's DONSTUART.net. I also have two other videos thus far in this series. One is entitled The Fallacy of Individualism. The other is How We Humans Know Who to Trust. Thank Darwin. Together, I think those three videos make up a view of humanity and of our intelligence that can be quite useful in understanding the world around us. Finally, if you found this video interesting, you might also enjoy reading my recent multiple award-winning science fiction novel, Darwin's Dilemma, a story of humans, AIs, and the future of intelligence. It's available on paperback and as an ebook on Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, and with booksellers everywhere. Thank you so very much for watching, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'll be sure to try to bring you more. Thank you.